CloudDB, shaping your new normal.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ricardo Gonzalez. I'm a product manager for the Oracle High Availability and Scalability product management team. I oversee Zero Downtime Migration, our main product and engine for moving your databases to the Oracle Cloud. I'm the product manager for ACFS, the ACFS Cluster File System. I'm going to talk today about ZDM 21.2, which is our latest release, how it works, how it was developed, different workflows and functionality, different methodologies, physical migration, logical migration, and how it can help you to automate and make simpler your process of moving your Oracle databases to the Oracle Cloud. Let's start first with today's agenda. I'm going to be talking about the overall overview of the product. So I'm going to be making an introduction about Oracle Zero Downtime Migration, how it works, its architecture, what we had in mind when the product was being developed, and how it can help you. Then I'm going to move on to migration methodologies. And I'm going to be talking about how ZDM can work with physical migration and with logical migration, and how can each one of them can help you with different scenarios when you're migrating your databases to the Oracle Cloud. Finally, I'm going to make a summary of the presentation, share some tips and some resources, information for you, where you can find best practices, etc. And that'll be it for today. Thank you so much. So let's start with the overall view of Oracle Zero Downtime Migration, or ZDM. When the product was created, we thought of making it as simple as possible. So the product gathers all the requirements for your migration, all the information that you provide to us for the migration, and then performs the cloud migration, meaning moving your database from on-premises to the Oracle Cloud. And as simple as possible as we can provide, of course. Then we leverage Oracle MAA, or Maximum Availability Architecture best practices. And the product is fully MAA compliant. We provide a secure and zero data loss way for you to move your database to the Oracle Cloud. And we also provide a free way for you to move the Oracle database to the Oracle Cloud. Because, of course, ZDM, even though it's a product, it has a license and it's fully supported, it's free. There's no charge for it. Regardless if you're using a physical migration or a logical migration approach, it doesn't matter which products you're using that are part of the ZDM automation, it's free and we don't charge you for the use of it, which is really important, and we're really happy and proud about that. So how does Zero Downtime Migration work? Well, first of all, the approach is simple. We do a single button approach. And the way we do this is that when you install ZDM, you'll find that there's a file called response file. This file, which you can create for each one of your migrations, has really important information. Basically, migration methodology, source, target, backup, location and type of backup, and some fine-tuning regarding the different aspects of your migration. So once you have fulfilled all of the requirements and have pre-filled this response file appropriately, you just issue a command in ZDM or Zero Downtime Migration. It will read the response file, look for to check that everything is in place and properly set up, and then it will migrate the database for you. So, of course, single button approach, simple and really convenient. Also, the product, as mentioned before, is super comprehensive. It's MAA compliant, meaning Maximum Availability Architecture compliant. You can pause and resume the migration if you want at some time. You could also start the migration by saying, I want you, once you reach this phase, please pause, and then I can do some testing and then continue. It offers a dry run option, which means you can do an evaluation of a migration, meaning you can migrate without migrating. Basically, it's just, I want to see what happens if I migrate, do some testing, but not actually migrate my data. So that's what the dry run or evaluation mode is. It also offers automated encryption. So if your source database is not encrypted, it doesn't matter. We will encrypt it in the target by default, because that's what it's, the default at the Oracle Cloud, it's TD enabled databases. But if the source is not TD enabled, that's completely fine. Now, we offer a centralized way to handle all of your migrations. You can schedule migrations by saying, I want to migrate my database Saturday at 4 in the morning, so ZDM will do that. We offer a comprehensive audit trail, so a lot of logs for you to then do auditing and reviewing. You can do many migrations in parallel, so you issue one migration command for one database, then another one for another database with a different response file, etc. So you can have many migrations happening at the same time, and ZDM will take care of that for you. So let's talk now about the architecture of Zero Downtime Migration. Now, bear in mind, there's 2 slides I will be sharing with you today regarding architecture. This one that covers overall architecture for physical migration, and the next one, which will be talking about architecture for logical migration. Now, they're both pretty much the same, but when we talk about logical migration with ZDM, there's a couple of extra components. So we'll talk about those in next slide. But right now, let's focus with what we have here. So first, we have the ZDM service node. That's where ZDM will be running. It could be a VM or any server. It could be deployed in the source server if you wanted to. It could be deployed in the cloud, in a compute node. It could be deployed in target. As long as it has a dedicated environment, it doesn't share a cluster or home, and it's running on Oracle Linux 7, we're fine. We don't require a lot of processing or capacity for the service node. Nothing fancy, nothing special. Now, we have the on-premises source database, which is your Oracle database that you're going to be migrating. Then we have the target database cloud service, which could be DBCS virtual machines, Exadata cloud service, Exadata cloud customer, and of course, if you want, you can also migrate to Exadata on-premises with ZDM. Then the backup location, if you're migrating to a Oracle Cloud Infrastructure-based database, then that backup location can be the object store. But if you're migrating to Exadata on-premises or Exadata Cloud Customer, the backup location, of course, will be NFS or the recovery plans. And of course, we have network connectivity because we have to be sure that ZDM can connect to the source database, the target database, backup location, etc. Now, as I mentioned in my previous slide, the architecture for logical migration is pretty much the same. So we have the same components as the ZDM service node, the on-premises source database, the target database, backup location, and network connectivity. But there's 2 extra components, right? There's a way to do a direct migration with logical migration in ZDM, which will leverage database links. So there's the possibility, and hence they enter into the picture as part of the overall architecture. But if not, you can still use a backup location when you're migrating with logical migration with ZDM. Now, if the logical migration, it's an online migration, ZDM will then leverage GoldenGate and will deploy a GoldenGate hub in OCI using a specific image from the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure Marketplace. This GoldenGate image has a specific licensing which can be used for 183 days. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there's no charge, which is amazing, right? So you have that there. You can do logical migration with ZDM, and this new component, which is the GoldenGate Hub, allows for that online migration to happen. And that's an overall view of how the architecture will look like in a logical migration scenario. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be talking today about 21.2, which is our latest release, Zero Downtime Migration 21.2. So let's talk a bit about the features and functionality of this release. Of course, from the source databases, we allow for migration from standard edition databases and enterprise edition databases on premises. This is Oracle databases, of course, from 11.204, 12c, 18c, and 19c versions. And of course, we also now allow Oracle databases running on AWS, Amazon Web Services, RDS. Those can be taken from that service and migrating into the Oracle Autonomous Database. So we have that as a source database now, which is great. It's a new feature from 21.2. Now, from source platforms, for physical and logical migration, we support Linux, so basically databases that are running on Linux platforms. And for logical migration, we support databases that are running on AIX and in Solaris. Now, targets, you can migrate to Database Cloud Service virtual machine. You can migrate to Exadata Cloud Service, Exadata Cloud at Customer and Exadata on premises. And you can also migrate databases to the autonomous database and the both transaction processing and autonomous data warehousing as well. ZDM also supports migration from non-CDB sources to CDB sources. This means non-container databases to container databases can be migrated both with the physical migration and the logical migration methodology. We support, of course, two ways of migrating, one physical and the other one logical. And we also support in-flight upgrade, meaning that you can move your databases from on-premises to the Oracle Cloud, but also at the same time perform upgrade. So let's say you have an 11.204 database on-premises, you can migrate it to a 19c database in the cloud with ZDM. This, of course, is only available with the logical migration workflow. Now, we leverage different technologies, but the main technology that we use in the different workflows is RMAN for physical offline migration, or a combination of RMAN and DataGuard for physical online migration, or Data Pump for logical offline migration, or a combination of Data Pump and GoldenGate for logical online migration. Now, what's new in Zero Downtime Migration 21.2? First of all, as I mentioned before, we have a new source database, which is Oracle databases running on AWS or Amazon Web Services, RDS. Also, we have new source platforms. So you have Oracle databases running on AIX or Solaris. They can now be also migrated with ZDM. We also have the ability to do physical direct data transfer, which means for physical migration, if you want, you can avoid the need of using a backup location. And I'll explain more about that in slides to come. You can also, for physical migration, if you already have an RMAN backup, you can reuse it rather than actually having ZDM create a new one. There's certain migration enhancements that we did in different areas. And of course, we included migration advisor enhancements that I'll be sharing with you in a bit. So let's go and see one by one all the different migration new features, functionalities, and what they're all about. So first we have the support for Oracle databases running on AWS RDS as source databases. These are supported now with the logical offline methodology, which means we will leverage Data Pump for this migration. And for transferring the data, we can use either database links or do an export-import that will go into an S3 bucket and then into the autonomous database as a target. Also, in Zero Downtime Migration 21.2, we introduced the capability to have Oracle databases running on AIX and Solaris as a source that can now be migrated to the Oracle Cloud. This is supported with the logical offline migration method, which can use a database link between the source and the target, or of course, backup location being either object store when you're migrating to an OCI native database, or NFS or the recovery appliance when you're migrating to Exadata Cloud at Customer. Now, when you're migrating a database with the physical online method, you will require a backup location so that ZDM can then transfer the RMAN backups and instantiate the target database. Now, in 21.2, we introduced the capability to make that optional. So now we have physical online migration with direct data transfer. That means that if you want, you can avoid using that intermediate store being the object store when you're migrating to OCI or NFS or the recovery appliance when you're migrating to Exadata or Exadata Cloud Customer, and then have a faster migration experience. The way this would work is that for databases that are 11.2, ZDM will do active database duplication, and for databases that are 12 or newer, we'll have a restore from service. Now, as mentioned, physical migration requires the use of RMAN to create a backup, right? ZDM will normally go and create a L0 backup and L1 backup, and then transfer them to a backup location to instantiate the standby in the target. But if there's an existing backup, you can actually point to it, and ZDM will then skip the backup creation phase of the migration and provide a faster migration experience for you. That's of course is optional, and if you don't want to do this, then that's fine. ZDM will then proceed as expected, which is creating the backup from scratch. Further migration enhancements that were introduced in Zero Downtime Migration 21.2 can be, summarized here. Now we have, for instance, when you're doing logical migration and we're doing a data pump dump size estimation, we can now do this via the statistics method if you prefer it. We now also offer the automatic creation or remapping of table spaces from the source to the target. If you provide action scripts for the migration, the ZDM can pick up on, they can now be modified locally. And then for the logical migration, the response file specifically, you might want to modify certain parameters once the migration is ongoing. You couldn't do that before. This is not something that it's possible to do as well. Finally, we have some pre-migration advisor enhancements. As you know, since 21, ZDM introduced a pre-migration advisor called CPAD that helps you analyze your migration work before starting the migration, specifically for the logical migration when you're migrating to autonomous database. This pre-migration advisor called CPAD can now be updated directly from the ZDM home every time you need to update it. And also when it provides remedial scripts, these can now be run and automated directly as well. So it's actually a really good introduction now in 21 to our latest release for Zero Downtime Migration. Okay, now let's move on and talk about migration methodologies. I'm going to start talking about ZDM Physical Migration, and then I'm going to move on to talk about ZDM Logical Migration. Now, before talking about ZDM Physical Migration specifically step by step and how it works, I want to properly discuss supported sources and targets, right? So, first of all, source versions. You can migrate 11.204 onwards, so Oracle databases 11.204, 12.1, 12.2, 18, 19c, etc. And then the same targets. But it's really important to understand that when you're doing physical migration, the source has to be the same as the target, meaning the same level for the version of the database. So if you're migrating from 11.204 database, you have to migrate to 11.204 database. If you're migrating from a 12.1 database, you have to migrate to 12.1 database, from a 19 to 19, etc. What can change is the patch level. So it doesn't matter if the patch level on the target is higher. What ZDM will do is it will run data patch at the end and iron out any details that need to be corrected. Now, before, you only could migrate from a non-CDB, non-container database, to a non-container database, or from a container database to a container database. This is not the case anymore. ZDM now allows for non-CDB to PDB, or pluggable databases, migration. And with the physical workflow, there's a bit of an offline, during the conversion. Once you have migrated database, we perform a plug-on-plug operation, but we have that in support now, which we didn't have that before for physical migration. Now, what platforms can you migrate to? You can migrate to Database Cloud Service Virtual Machine. You can migrate to Exadata Cloud Service. You can migrate to Exadata Cloud Customer. And of course, if you're doing a hardware refresh project and you're migrating, you have new Exadatas on premises, you can also use ZDM to migrate your Oracle databases to the new Exadatas. Now, ZDM Physical Migration has two ways of working. One, it's an offline migration, which has one specific flavor for the migration. And then you have physical online migration, which has two different ways of working. Let's talk first about physical offline migration. Physical offline migration supports Oracle Standard Edition databases and Oracle Enterprise Edition databases. It basically uses a backup and restore mechanism in which ZDM leverages RMAN to create a backup of the database, transfer the backup files to a backup location, instantiate a target database, and then performs the switch over. Whereas with physical online migration, you have different ways of working. First of all, yes, it will also leverage RMAN, or the recovery manager, but also it will leverage data guard to provide a full synchronization of the source database and the target database. Now, ZDM can either transfer backup files to a backup location, as the same as it would do with the physical offline workflow, or you can use a direct data transfer as mentioned before. So that's also that difference. Now, it's important to understand that the online migration for physical, it's only available for enterprise edition databases. So now let's actually talk about how ZDM would work for physical online migration using a backup location. And I'll go and talk about it on a step-by-step fashion. So I'm going to explain specifically how it works on a step-by-step. Now I'm going to explain how it works on a step-by-step basis, from the download of the product all the way to the finalization of the migration. So the first step, of course, is to download ZDM. You can do so by going to ZDM's product website, www.oracle.com/go-to/ZDM. You'll download ZDM on the server node where you are going to be running ZDM. As I mentioned before, the requirements are, minimum. We just want to have Oracle Linux 7 running there and some other minimum requirements. You can see more in our documentation, which you can find in the same website where you can download ZDM. Now, once you have downloaded ZDM, install the product and configure it, remember I talked about the response file, which is a file that has information on the migration type, backup location, source database, target database, etc. So you're going to configure that response file and pre-fill it with the proper information. In this case, you're going to tell the response file that we will be doing physical online migration. Talk about the source database on premises, target database, etc. Once that information is in place, you can start the migration process, which comes next. So you issue the migration command. Remember that ZDM runs on a command line based tool. So basically you will say ZDM CLI migrate database. That's the name of the command line interface and the migration command. You provide information about the response file, information about the source and target database, and ZDM starts the migration process. So here, everything that happens now, it's completely automated and orchestrated by ZDM. First, it will connect to the source database and the target database in the cloud via SSH connectivity, and we'll be sure that everything is in place. So basically, databases are from the same version, we're good to go, all secure, proper connectivity can be established, etc. So if it's good to go, then ZDM will start the migration process and continue. And how does ZDM continue? Well, it'll then start creating the backups I mentioned, the L0 and L1 backups from the primary database on premises, and we'll start a connection between that primary database and the backup location of your choice. In this case, let's pretend we're migrating to Exadata Cloud Services. So this backup location will be a bucket of object store or object storage in your cloud tenancy. Now, ZDM starts the orchestration of transferring those backup files from the primary database on premises to the backup location in the Oracle Cloud. Once the transfer of the backup files has been finalized, ZDM will use those backup files on the backup location and instantiate a standby database in the cloud. So this is great because now you have two databases. You have your primary database on premises, which still has a running workload. The application is connected to that primary database, but you also have a standby database in the cloud. Of course, that database is created out of a backup, so it's not fully in sync, but that is what comes next and the next step for ZDM. So, in order to provide synchronization between the primary database and the target database in the cloud, which is now a standby database, ZDM will leverage DataGuard. And in order to do so, what ZDM does is it establishes SQLnet connectivity between the primary database and the standby database and starts the synchronization process. Now, you could actually pause here the migration if you wanted to. There's even a way to start the migration and at that moment tell ZDM when you arrive in this phase or some other phases if you want to, please pause. So then you can do all the testing you want on the standby, be sure that everything is fine before any switch over, before any role swap of the databases. So you could pause here if you wanted to, and if not, ZDM will continue the process by, of course, synchronizing the database and then proceeding with the migration. That's up to you. Now the next step, of course, is for ZDM to perform a switch over. So now the application is pointing to the cloud and a role swap. So now the source database is now a standby database and the target database in the cloud is a primary database. This is great. And you could actually configure ZDM to leave the configuration this way when it finishes up and cleans up, or ZDM will continue its work and then perform a proper cleanup, stop connectivity between source, target, etc. But bear in mind the following, right? All databases in the cloud have transparent data encryption or TD by default, whereas not necessarily all the source databases will have this. So if you want to keep up, a DR configuration, disaster recovery, in which you have a DataGuard configuration set up, in which you have the primary database in the cloud and standby on premises, you need to be sure that your on-premises database is then TD enabled or transparent data encryption enabled. And as you know, these of course has implications. You need to get the advanced security license, but also when databases are 11.2 and 12.1, TD enabling them, so transparent data encryption enablement, it's an offline operation. If they're 12.2 or higher versions, then it's an online operation. So it's important you take all of these considerations in mind when performing the migration if you want to keep up a communication between the new cloud database and your deployment on premises. Finally, ZDM will then, once the synchronization is in place, the switchover and the role swap is in place, ZDM will proceed to finalize the migration. That means proper cleanup of source and target environments, all the connections and connectivity that was required, and then exit gracefully. And then you will have your application connected to a primary database in the cloud, and you have successfully migrated your database using ZDM Physical Online Migration. Having covered all that is to be covered about physical migration, now let's move and talk about zero downtime migration, specifically the logical migration workflow. And just as we did for physical migration, before going into the different architecture and step-by-step scenarios for logical migration, let's talk about the supported sources and supported targets. So logical migration in ZDM allows for source versions 11.204 onwards and targets 11.204 and higher as well. A big difference here is that you can actually migrate cross version, or meaning you can perform an in-flight upgrade. What does that mean? It means that if you are on 11G, you can actually migrate to 19C, or if you're in 12C, you can migrate to 19C. So basically you can migrate to a higher target version if you want to. Also, we perform non-CDB to PDB conversion, so you have that option as well with logical migration. Now, target platforms, of course, Database Cloud Service, Autonomous Database, Exadata Cloud Service, and Exadata Cloud Customer. One thing that I want to remind, even though I already talked about it at the beginning, is that with logical migration, you can migrate databases that are, the source is in Linux, or the source is in AIX or in Solaris. And also logical migration allows for migrating Oracle databases that are running on AWS, Amazon Web Services, on RDS, into the autonomous database as well. So logical migration offers a wide array of sources and targets and combinations for your migration. Zero Downtime Migration, Logical Migration offers two different workflows within the logical methodology. You can do logical offline migration. Basically, it uses Data Pump, and what it does is it uses an export-import mechanism for exporting Data Pump dump files to a backup location, or to doing a direct connection with database links, and then doing an import on the target when you're instantiate a new database, and then ZDM will perform the switch over. Now, there's also the logical online migration, which allows for Data Pump and GoldenGate as well. And while using GoldenGate, this allows for an online way of migrating your database, because you use Data Pump export import, but then the synchronization happens with GoldenGate. All of these, of course, orchestrated and synchronized by ZDM, and each one of these, of course, have different, features and functionality and different ways of working. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the logical online migration with Data Pump, GoldenGate, and a backup location, which is the most common use case for logical migration. So I'm going to go step by step and explain and share with you how does it work. Now, before starting the step-by-step overview of the online migration with backup location for ZDM logical methodology, I'm going to also talk about the architecture, because this has the GoldenGate hub, and I think it's important to talk about the different components of the migration. So I'm going to do it next. Here we have an overall diagram on how ZDM logical online migration with the backup location would work. So let's see each one of the components. We have the ZDM service node. We have then the on-premises source database and the target database in the cloud. ZDM connects to both, of course. Then we have the source database that connects to the backup location, and it will use Data Pump for the export-import of the database dump files. And then, of course, the backup location is connected to the target database because it's in the in customer's tenancy in the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure deployment. Now, also we have compute Oracle Cloud Infrastructure compute node that is running as a GoldenGate hub that has two microservices. One GoldenGate microservice working as an extract, and one GoldenGate microservice working as a Replicat. The extract is connected to the source database, and the Replicat to the target database. They both connect and work together so that the databases can be kept in sync. We also have the application connected to the source database, which of course ZDM will perform the switchover once the migration is finalized to the target database in the cloud. So having covered this, let's talk about specifically how logical online migration with a backup location works on a step-by-step basis. The first step, as with the physical migration, is to download and configure ZDM. Same steps apply: downloading ZDM on a VM running Oracle Linux 7, and then configuring the product, and after installation and proper configuration, pre-feeding the response file with all the information regarding the source database, target database, backup location, GoldenGate hub, etc. And then issue the migration command so that ZDM will start the migration process. ZDM will proceed to connect to the source database on premises and to the target database in the cloud, and perform all the required validations to be sure that it can proceed with the migration. And once those have been fulfilled, ZDM will continue and perform the database migration. ZDM then proceeds to connect to the backup location, perform storage sizing considerations and verifications, and then proceeds with the migration process. ZDM then proceeds to configure an Oracle GoldenGate microservice in the GoldenGate hub. This microservice is an extract. What it would do is it'll start capturing transactions from the source database and generating what we call trail files. these files will be stored in the GoldenGate Hub and then will be used by the second microservice that will be configured soon to synchronize the database in the target, which is the database that we're migrating. So this is a crucial step that is really important because it will allow ZDM to have an online fashion of migration. Basically, ZDM will provide an online migration by leveraging GoldenGate. And the first step, of course, is this first microservice configuration that will act as an extract. Now, the next step, of course, is for ZDM to start a data pump export job. This happens on the on-premises source Oracle database, where ZDM will start doing this export job that then will be transferred to the backup location. And it's really important because those dump files that are generated from the data pump export job will be used to instantiate a target database in the cloud. Now, the next step, of course, is for ZDM to start a data pump import job on the target that will leverage the dump files that were transferred to or exported to the backup location to instantiate now a target database in the cloud. But let's step back a second and talk about different targets. If you're migrating to an autonomous database, then this step is exactly as this. ZDM starts a data pump import job at the target database, the autonomous database, and then imports the dump files and instantiates a new database in the cloud. But let's say the target is actually Database Cloud Service or Exadata Cloud Service or Cloud Customer. Then in this case, what ZDM does is that it copies those dump files from the backup location to a local file system on the target and then starts the data pump import job and instantiates the target database. Now, with this target database now instantiated in the cloud, the next step is to synchronize it and put it fully in sync with the on-premise database that is our source. So that's what comes next, and I'll explain how it works in the next slide. Now, in order to fully synchronize the source database with the target database, what ZDM does is, of course, it leverages GoldenGate. As I mentioned, we have a GoldenGate hub on the Oracle Cloud, and it uses a specific image from the Oracle Cloud Marketplace, that has a specific license for the usage of migrating your database between on-premises to the cloud when you're using ZDM or the Database Migration Service, which is a product that Oracle also has, and it's powered by ZDM. Now, this GoldenGate hub that has two GoldenGate microservices has one as an extract that is feeding or capturing transactions and all the information from the source database. And now in this step, what ZDM does is it configures another microservice that will act as an Oracle GoldenGate Replicat, which feeds from the extract and applies all the changes to the target database on the cloud. So basically you have now a target database in the cloud that is being synchronized by GoldenGate, and when the synchronization is done and ZDM is ready to continue, what ZDM does is the next step, which is finalize that migration properly by switching over and cleaning everything, which will happen next, and I'll explain in the next slide. So the final step is, of course, for ZDM to perform the switchover. Now you have the target database in the cloud and the application connected to it. It's the full migration fully completed. Then, of course, ZDM will proceed to clean up all the environment, all the connections, all the work done, the GoldenGate hub, etc. So overall, ZDM uses different products as Data Pump and then, of course, amazing technology like GoldenGate to perform this online migration with a logical workflow, and then has, of course, now your application connected to your target database in the cloud. So it's a great way of moving your database to the cloud with versatility. It offers the possibility to do, as I mentioned before, in-flight upgrades, so you can migrate an older version of the database to a newer version as well to the cloud, and it uses great technology. So yeah, this is the overview of how logical online migration with a backup location works with ZDM. So, in summary, ZDM is the best-in-class solution for moving your databases to the cloud. ZDM powers the migration to the cloud. Not only is the main engine and product from moving your database to the cloud, it also powers other products in Oracle, like the database migration service. ZDM has a wide array of migration sources. You can migrate databases that are running on Linux, databases that are running on AIX, and databases that are running on Solaris. You can also migrate Oracle databases that are running on AWS, Amazon Web Services, RDS. You can migrate databases from 11.12.4 onwards for the version level, and you have a wide array of migration targets. You can migrate your databases to Database Cloud Service Virtual Machine, to Exadata Cloud Service, to Exadata Cloud at Customer, to Exadata on-premises, and you can migrate your databases to the Autonomous Database, both in Autonomous Transaction Processing and in Autonomous Data Warehouse. You have multiple migration workflows, both physical and logical, either or both of them using offline methodology and an online methodology, depending on your choice and your migration needs. Physical migration leverages the Recovery Manager, RMAN, and DataGuard. Logical migration leverages Data Pump and GoldenGate. We have the best-in-class features and functionality like non-CDB to CDB conversion, the migration advisor, physical direct file transfer, and many more great features within and built in ZDM. And of course, we're cost-effective. ZDM is a cost-effective solution that allows you to migrate your database to the cloud free. There's no cost to use. The product doesn't have a price, which is great, and we provide this and fully support the product for you. Now, before finishing this session, I want to share with you some resources that are going to be really useful for your migration. First of all, our product website, www.oracle.com/go-to/ZDM. You can find step-by-step guides for physical and logical migration. You can find the latest blog posts, videos of the product. You can also find our documentation, and also you can download ZDM from there. And also the links to our documentation and the two main step-by-step guides. The first one for physical migration, and of course the one for logical migration as well. So please, copy these links and visit us in our website. Thank you so much for being with me today. You can follow me at my account at ProductManaged in Twitter. I really appreciate that you came and learned about Zero Downtime Migration. It's been my great pleasure to be with you.
CloudDB, shaping your new normal.